In doing these videos about the 50s and 60s, back when I was young and supple, as my grandma would say, um, sometimes it's a little bit melancholy, I guess, about it. Tonight I was listening to some streaming music. Um, and then it occurred to me how far we've come in that regard. Um, I mean, when I was really very young, back in the late 50s, we were still using 78 RPM records, which were basically shellac, I guess, um, heavy things. They turned real fast, and you didn't get much music on them because it um, certainly wasn't a long play kind of thing. And then next came, of course, the 45 RPM records, which was, I remember with great fondness. That's, back when you would go to the record store and spend $1 and you could get a record with two songs, one on each side. The hits of the day, like Duke of Earl or I can't. Anyway, the really, really old stuff, Patsy Cline. Anyway, really old stuff. They had to be cheap to produce because, I mean, at the retail outlet, they were $1 a piece. So the cost to press those things couldn't have been more than a dime or 15 cents. And they had a big hole in the center. So it took a special spindle or an adapter for each record to go on a smaller spindle. And the average playing time on those was what? Probably the maximum time was 6 minutes. Most songs were 3-4 minutes long. Then the next thing that came along was I don't know whether 8-track. I guess 8-track and the cassettes came out about the same time. The 8-tracks were, of course, used in the cars. And they didn't last very long. They get jammed up and you couldn't unjam them. Once they were jammed up, you had to throw them away. And they were relatively expensive, $5 or $6 a piece. Although it was a complete album, 5 or 6 songs, maybe more. But the quality was mediocre. And the first cassette recorders and players were also pretty poor quality. Over time, the magnetic tape used in both those devices improved. So we got better quality, and the magnetic pickup heads got better, and the electronics got better. Everything got better. And then, of course, it was the LPs, the 78 RPM. Well, that wasn't 78 RPM. That was 33 1/3 long play records. And those are still produced to this day. Not so many anymore. The vinyl records are. But anyway, a lot of the audio fights still like the audio, the analog recordings instead of digital, because the digital takes samples every few milliseconds, and so it then does a algorithm which connects the dots, so to speak. So it does, some of the detail drops out, although I question whether most people's ear would ever detect the difference. Mine certainly wouldn't. So anyway, there's a lot of things that went along with it during that period of time. The transistor radio. The first portable radio I ever had was in the late 50s, and it was what were they called? It was a crystal radio. Uh, you young folks don't even know what that is. Um, I'm not sure I can explain it. It's basically would take a magnet on a stick, so to speak, that would run through a tube of um, wire. And as you moved it, that would change the frequency of the pickup. It took a very strong broadcast signal for it to pick up anything, but that was the first portable device we had, and it didn't require any power at all. No batteries, nothing. It was just. On the other hand, it wouldn't drive a speaker, so you had to use an earphone. So it was, and of course, it wasn't in stereo, and it wasn't. It wasn't high five. Then the transistor radios came out. When they came out, they were pretty expensive. They were about $25, and that's back when a person might be paid $50 a week. So it'd take a half a week's pay to buy one of those early transistor radios, and they were pretty good size. There'd be, they'd brag about being 4 transistors or 6 transistors or 8 transistors. And of course, nowadays in our modern computers, the number of transistors in a CPU is measured in the billions. So those are the kind of things. And there's stories to go along with all of them, memories to go along with all of them. You'd carry your transistor radio to the pool. Back in that day, the biggest entertainment venue was Misty Waters. There was another one, Clifton Springs, but I never went to that one much. But Misty Waters was the place. They had a roller rink, they had a big lake you could swim in, and a swimming pool, and then they had a building that had pinball machines and all the mechanical devices. There was no such thing as an electronic game back then, and that was very nice. And the admission price was, in fact, I'm not sure there was any admission at all to the pool or the lake. They would make some money off the pinball machines and whatnot, and of course the skating rink would charge if you went skating. And on Saturday nights they'd have what we'd call sock hops. And for those of you who don't know what a sock hop is, typically those were done at school auditoriums, basketball courts, and on floors that they didn't want scratched up. And back in that day, people would often put metal taps on their shoes, bottom of their shoes, and not for tap dancing, but just to make them last longer. But that would be havoc on a wood floor. So anyway, on those dances, you had to remove your shoes, and so you danced in sock feet. And at Misty Waters, to be such a small venue, there were some name acts who came through there in the late 50s. Some of the Detroit Motown groups came through there. Wayne Newton, he couldn't have been more than, well, he wasn't even 20 years old, I guess, at that time. I mean, in his late teens. He and his dad were a 2-man group. And of course, he was gifted from the get-go. He could play several instruments, had that great voice. And his dad would play the drums. But a lot of groups, something like, hopefully a lot of you who view this will know what American Bandstand was. That was the big deal on TV. Um, and so it was sort of that kind of spirit, where you had um, the teenagers and young adults too would go to these sock hops and dance. Remember, back in that day, TV was black and white. I can't recall exactly when they could start recording um, the images so that they could play them anytime. But in the 50s, mostly it had to be live performances because there was no way to record them. And so most of those just ran at night for short periods of times, and the quality was poor because it was done by local musicians and whatnot. It wasn't big Hollywood productions. So the sock hops and roller skating was a pretty big deal. Excuse me. But anyway, a lot of memories associated with that. This was, of course, before I was old enough to drive a car, so I had to depend on my parents taking me, which limited my ability to go. I was fortunate in that my mom did not work full time in much of the time I was growing up, so she could take me to those things, and it was a chance to get me and my brother out of her hair. So she would. It was probably about between 8 and 10 miles from our home, so it was a pretty good hike. But gasoline was probably 20 cents a gallon back then. So, okay, I don't want to make these things too terribly long, so I'll end it with that. I'm going to call this video 45 RPM. I'm going to continue this whole series of 50s and 60s as I can think of things and whatnot. All right, if you'll hit subscribe, like, and notify, I would appreciate it. Thank you.